This is The Queen of Spades by Alexander Pushkin.
There was a card party in the rooms of Narrated, an officer of the Horse Guards. The long winter night had passed unnoticed, and it was after 4 a.m. when the company sat down for supper. Those who had won enjoyed their food, the others sat absent-mindedly in front of empty plates. But when the champagne appeared, conversation became more lively and general. "How did you fare, Surin?" Narrated asked. "Oh, I lost as usual. I must confess I have no luck. I stick to Mirandol, never get excited, never lose my head, and yet I never win." "Do you mean to tell me that you were not once tempted back to the whole evening? Your self-control amazes me." "But look at Herman," exclaimed one of the party, pointing to a young officer of the engineers. "Never held a car in his hands, never made a bet in his life, and yet he sits until 5 a.m. watching us play." "Cards interest me very much," said Herman, "but I am not in a position to risk necessary in the hope of acquiring the superfluous." "Herman is a German. He's careful. That's what it is," remarked Tomsky. "But if there's one person I can't understand, it is my grandmother, Countess Anna Fedotovna." "Why is that?" the guest cried. "I cannot conceive how it is that my grandmother does not play. But surely there is nothing surprising in an old lady in the 80s not wanting to gamble," said Narrated. "Then you don't know nothing about her?" "No, nothing. Absolutely nothing." "Well, listen then. I must tell you that some 60 years ago my grandmother went to Paris and was quite the rage there. People would run after her to catch a glimpse of a Venus Muscovite. Richelieu was at her beck and call, and Grandmamma maintained that he very nearly blew his brains out because of her cruelty to him. In those days ladies used to play faro. One evening at the court she lost a very considerable sum to the Duke of Orleans. When she got home, she told my grandfather of Grandmamma gave him a box on the ear and retired to bed untying her without giving him a sign of her displeasure, and commanded him to pay. The following morning, she sent for her husband. My grandfather, hoping, so far as I can remember, that the simple punishment had its major domo to my grandmother. But she found him as obdurate as ever. He feared her like fire. For the first time in her life, when he heard of so far as to reason with him and explain, he almost went out of his mind, rouse his conscience, fetched for bills and pointed out to her that in 6 months they had spent 1,000,000 rubles, and that a prince in Paris was different from a coachman. Neither their Moscow nor their Sarasov a bit of good upon which to draw. Grandfather, and he would just not hear of it, refused to pay. Once and for all, no. Grandmamma did not know what to do. Again, her close acquaintances, she had one which was a very remarkable man. You may have heard of the Count of Saint-Germain, about whom so many marvellous stories are told. You know that he posed as the wandering Jew and claimed to have discovered the elixir of life and the philosopher's stone, and so on. People laughed at him as a charlatan, and Casanova in his memoirs say that he was a spy. Be that as it may, Saint-Germain, in spite of the mystery that surrounded him, had the most dignified appearance and was a very amiable person in society. Grandmamma is still to this day quite devoted to his memory and gets angry if anyone speaks of him with disrespect. Grandmamma knew that Saint-Germain had plenty of money at his disposal. She decided to appeal to him and wrote a note asking for him to come and see her immediately. The eccentric old man came at once and found her in terrible distress. She described in the blackest colours of her husband's inhumanity and ended by declaring that she laid all of her hopes on his friendship and his kindness. Saint-Germain pondered. "I could oblige you with the sum you want, but I know that you would not be easy until you would be paid me, and I should not like to involve you in fresh trouble. There is another way out. You could win it back." "But my dear Count," answered Grandmamma, "I tell you I have no money at all." "That does not matter," Saint-Germain replied. "Listen now to what I am going to tell you." And he revealed to her a secret which all of us would give a great deal to know. The young gamblers redoubled their attention. Tomsky lit his pipe and puffed away for a moment and continued. That very evening Grandmamma appeared at Versailles, at the Jeu de la Reine. The Duke of Orleans kept the bank. Grandmamma lightly excused herself for not having brought the money to pay off her debt, inventing some little story by way of explanation, and began to play against him. She selected 3 cards and played them one after the other. All 3 won, and Grandmama retrieved her loss completely. "Luck," said one of the party. "A fairy tale," remarked Herman. "Marked cards, perhaps," put in a third. "But I don't think so," replied Tomsky impressively. "What?" said Naramov. "You have a grandmother who knows how to hit upon 3 lucky cards in succession, and you haven't learnt her secret yet." "That's the deuce of it," Tomsky replied. "She had 4 sons, one of whom was my father. All 4 were desperate gamblers, and yet she did not reveal her secret to a single one of them. Though it would not have been a bad thing for them, or for me either. But listen to what my uncle, Count Ivan Ilyich, used to say, assuring me on his word of honour that it was true. Chaplitsky, you know him, he died a pauper after squandering millions. As a young man, he once lost 300,000 rubles to Zorik. If I remember rightly, he was in despair. Grandmama was always very severe on the follies of young men, but somehow she took pity on Chaplitsky. She gave him 3 cards, which he was to play one after the other, at the same time exacting from him a promise that he would never afterwards touch a card as long as he lived. Chaplitsky went to Zorich's and they sat down to play. Chaplitsky staked 50,000 on his first card and won. Doubled his stake and won. Did the same again, won back his loss and ended up in pocket. But I say, it's time to go to bed. It is 5:45 already. Indeed, dawn was breaking. The young men emptied their glasses and went home. The Countess was seated before the looking-glass in her dressing room. 3 maids were standing around her. One held a pot of rouge, another a box of hairpins, and a third a tall cap with flame-coloured ribbons. The Countess had not the slightest pretensions to beauty. It had faded long ago, but she still preserved all the habits of her youth, and followed strictly in the fashion of the 70s, and gave as much time and care to her toilette as she had 60 years before. A young girl whom she'd brought up sat in an embroidery frame by the window. "Good morning, Grandmaman," said a young officer, coming into the room. "Bonjour, Mademoiselle Lise. Grandmama, I have a favour to ask of you." "What is it, Paul?" "I want you to let me introduce you to a friend of mine and bring him to your ball on Friday." "Bring him straight to the ball and introduce him to me then. Were you at the Princess's last night?" "Of course I was. It was most enjoyable. We danced until 5 in the morning. Mademoiselle Yeletsky looked enchanting." "Come, my dear, what is there enchanting about her? She isn't a patch on her grandmother, Princess Daria Petrovna. By the way, I expect Princess Daria Petrovna must have aged considerably." "How do you mean aged?" Tomsky replied absent-mindedly. "She's been dead for the last 7 years." The girl at the window raised her head and made a sign to the young man. He remembered that they concealed the deaths of her contemporaries from the old Countess, and bit his lip. But the Countess heard the news with the utmost indifference. "Dead? I didn't know. We were maids of honour together, as we were being presented to the Empress." And for the 100th time the Countess repeated the story to her grandson. "Well, Paul," she said at the end, "now help me to my feet. Lise, where is my snuff-box?" And the Countess went with her maids behind the screen to finish dressing. Tomsky was left à deux with the young girl. "Who is it you want to introduce?" Lizaveta Ivanovna asked softly. "Naramov. Do you know him?" "No. Is he in the army?" "Yes." "In the engineers?" "No, Horse Guards." "What made you think he was in the engineers?" The girl laughed and made no answer. "Paul," the Countess called from behind the screen, "send me a new novel to read, only pray not one of those modern ones." "How do you mean, Grandmama?" "I want a book in which the hero does not strangle either his father or his mother, where there are no drowned corpses. I have a horror of drowned persons." "There aren't many novels of that sort nowadays. Wouldn't you like something in Russian?" "Are there any Russian novels? Send me something, my dear fellow. Please, send me something." Excuse me, Grandmama, I must hurry. Goodbye, Lizaveta Ivanova. I wonder what made you think Naramov was in the engineers. And Tomsky departed from a dressing room. Lizaveta Ivanova was left alone. She abandoned her work and began to look out of a window. Soon, round the corner of her house on the other side of the street, a young officer appeared. Colour flooded her cheeks. She took up her work again, bending her head over her embroidery frame. At that moment, the Countess came in, having finished dressing. "Order the carriage, Lise," she said, "and let us go for a drive." Lizaveta Ivanova rose from her embroidery frame and began putting away her work. "What is the matter with you, my child? Are you deaf?" the Countess cried. "Be quick and order my carriage." "I will go at once," the young girl answered quietly, and ran into the anteroom. A servant came in and was handed the Countess a parcel of books from Prince Paul Alexandrovitch. "Good. Tell him I am much obliged," said the Countess. Lise, where are you off to?" "To dress." "There's plenty of time, my dear. Sit down here. Open the first volume and read to me." The girl took out the book and read a few lines. "Louder," said the Countess. "What is the matter with you, my dear? Have you lost your voice, or what? Wait a minute. Give me that footstool. A little closer. That will do." Lizaveta read 2 more pages. The Countess yawned. "Throw the book away," she said. "What nonsense it is. Send it back to Prince Paul with my thanks. What about the carriage?" "The carriage is ready," said Lizaveta Ivanova, glancing out into the street. "How is it you're not dressed?" the Countess said. "You always keep people waiting. It is really intolerable." Lisa ran into her room. Hardly 2 minutes passed before the Countess started ringing with all of her might. 3 maids rushed in at one door and a footman at the other. "Why is it you don't come when you're called?" the Countess said to them. "Tell Lizaveta Ivanova that I am waiting." Lizaveta Ivanova returned, wearing a hat and a pelisse. "At last, my dear," said the Countess. "Why the finery? What is it for? For whose benefit? And what is the weather like? Windy, isn't it?" "No, your ladyship," the footman answered. "There is no wind at all." "You say anything that comes into your head. Open the window." "Just as I thought. There is a wind, and a very cold one too. Dismiss the carriage, Lise, my child. We won't go out. You need not to have dressed up at all." And this is my life, Lizaveta Ivanova thought to herself. Indeed, Lizaveta Ivanova was the most unfortunate creature. "Another's bread is bitter to the taste," said Dante, "and his staircase is hard to climb. And who should know the bitterness of my dependence better than by a poor orphan brought up by an old lady of quality? The Countess was certainly not a bad-hearted person, but she had all the caprices of a woman spoiled by society. She was stingy and coldly selfish, like all old people who have done with love and are out of touch with life around them. She took part in all the vanities of a fashionable world, dragged herself to balls, where she sat in the corner rouged and attired like some bygone mode, like a misshapen but indispensable ornament of a ballroom. On their arrival, all the guests went up to her and bowed low, as though in accordance to an old established rite, and after that no one took any more notice of her. She received the whole town at her house, observing the strictest etiquette and not recognising the faces of many of her guests. Her numerous servants had grown fat and grey in her entrance hall, and the maids' quarters did what they liked and vied with each other in robbing the decrepit old woman. Lizaveta Ivanova was the household martyr. She poured out tea and was reprimanded for using too much sugar. She read novels aloud to the Countess and was blamed for all of the author's mistakes. She accompanied the Countess on her drives and was answerable for the weather and the state of her roads. She was supposed to receive a salary, which was never paid in full, and yet she was expected to be as well dressed as everyone else. That is, very few indeed. In society, she played the most pitiable role. Everybody knew her and nobody gave her any thought. At balls, she danced only when someone was short of a partner, and the ladies would take her by the arm each time they wanted to go to the cloakroom to rearrange some detail of their toilette. She was sensitive and felt her position keenly, and looked about impatiently for a deliverer to come, but the young men, calculating in their empty-headed frivolity, honoured her with scant attention, though Lizaveta Ivanova was 100 times more charming than the cold, brazen-faced heiress that they ran after. Many a time she crept away from a tedious, glittering drawing room to go and weep in her humble little attic with its wallpaper screen, chest of drawers, a small looking-glass and a painted wooden bedstead, and where a tallow candle burned dimly in a brass candlestick. One morning, 2 days after the card party described at the beginning of this story, and a week before the scene we have just witnessed, one morning, Lizaveta Ivanova, sitting at her embroidery frame by the window, happened to glance out into the street and see a young engineer's officer standing, stock still, gazing at her window. She lowered her head and went out with her work. 5 minutes afterwards, she looked out again. The young officer was still on the same spot. Not being in the habit of coquetting with passing officers, she looked out no more and went on sewing for a couple of hours without raising her head. Luncheon was announced. She got up to put away her embroidery frame, and glancing casually into the street, she saw the officer again. This seemed to her somewhat strange. After luncheon she went to the window with a certain feeling of uneasiness, but the officer was no longer there, and she forgot about him. A day or so later, just as she was stepping into the carriage with the Countess, she saw him again. He was standing right by the door, his haze hidden by his beaver collar, and his dark eyes sparkled beneath his fur cap. Lizaveta Ivanova felt alarmed, though she did not know why, and seated herself in the carriage, inexplicably agitated. On returning home, she ran to the window. The officer was standing in his unaccustomed place, with his eyes fixed on her. She drew back, consumed with curiosity and excited by a feeling quite new to her. Since then, not a day had passed without the young man appearing at a certain hour beneath the windows of their house. Between him and a sort of mute acquaintance was established. Sitting at her work, she would sense his approach, and lifting her head, she looked at him longer and longer every day. The young man seemed to be grateful for her looking out. With the keen eyes of youth, she saw the quick flush of his pale cheeks every time their glances met. By the end of a week, she had smiled at him. When Tomsky asked the Countess's permission to introduce a friend of his, the poor girl's heart beat violently. But hearing that Naramov was in the Horses Guards, not the Engineers, she regretted the indiscreet question by which she had betrayed his secret to the irresponsible Tomsky. Hermann was the son of a German who had settled in Russia and who had left him a small capital sum. Being firmly convinced that it was essential for him to make certain of his independence, Hermann did not even touch the interest on his income, but lived on his pay, denying himself the slightest extravagance. But since he was reserved and ambitious, his companions rarely had an opportunity for making fun of his extreme parsimony. He had strong passions and an ardent imagination, but strength of character preserved him from the customary mistakes of youth. Thus, for instance, though a gambler at heart, he never touched cards, having decided that his means did not allow him to risk the necessary in the hope of acquiring the superfluous. And yet he spent night after night at the card tables, watching with feverish anxiety the vicissitudes of the game. The story of the free cards had made a powerful impression upon his imagination, and it haunted his mind all night. Supposing, he thought to himself, the following evening as he wandered at Petersburg, supposing the old Countess were to reveal her secret to me, or tell me the free winning cards. Why wouldn't I try my luck? Get introduced to her, win her favour, become her lover perhaps. But all that would take time, and she is 87. She might be dead next week, or the day after tomorrow even. And the story itself, is it likely? No. Economy, moderation and hard work are my three winning cards. With them I can treble my capital, increase it sevenfold, and obtain for myself my leisure and my independence. Musing thus, he found himself in one of the main streets of Petersburg, in front of a house of old-fashioned architecture. The street was lined with carriages which followed one another up a lighted porch. Out of the carriages stepped now the shapely little foot of a young beauty, now a military boot with a clinking spur, or a diplomat's striped stockings and buckled shoes. Fur coats and cloaks passed in rapid procession before the majestic-looking concierge. Hermann stopped. "Whose house is that?" he asked a watchman in his box at the corner. "That's the Countess's," the man told him. It was Tomsky's grandmother. Hermann started. The strange story of the free cards came into his mind again. He began walking up and down past the house, thinking of its owner and her wonderful secret. It was late when he returned to his humble lodgings. He could not get to sleep for a long time, and when he did sleep, he dreamed of cards, a green baize table, stacks of banknotes, and piles of gold. He played card after card, resolutely turning down the corners, winning all the time. He raked in the gold and stuffed his pockets with banknotes. Waking late in the morning, he sighed over the loss of his fantastic wealth, and then, sallying forth to wander about the town again, once more found himself outside the Countess's house. It was as though some supernatural force drew him there. He stopped and looked up at one of the windows. In one of them he saw a dark head bent over a book or some needlework. Then the head was raised. Hermann caught sight of a rosy face and a pair of black eyes. That moment decided his fate. Lizaveta Ivanovna had scarcely taken off her hat and mantle before the Countess sent for her and again ordered the carriage. They went out to take their seats. Just as the two footmen were lifting the old lady and helping her through the carriage door, Lizaveta Ivanovna saw the engineer's officer standing by the wheel. He seized her hand. Before she had recovered from her alarm, the young man had disappeared, leaving a letter between her fingers. She hid it in her glove, and for the rest of the drive neither saw nor heard anything. It was the Countess's habit, when they were out in the carriage, to ask a constant stream of questions. Who was that we met? What bridge is this? What does that signboard say? This time, Lizaveta Ivanovna returned such random and irrelevant answers that the Countess grew angry with her. What is the matter with you, my dear? Have you taken leave of your senses? Don't you hear me or understand what I say? I speak distinctly enough, thank heaven, and I'm not in my dotage yet. Lizaveta Ivanovna paid no attention to her. When they returned home, she ran up to her room and drew the letter out of her glove. It was unsealed. She read it. The letter contained a declaration of love. It was tender, respectful, and had been copied word for word from a German novel. But Lizaveta Ivanovna did not know any German, and she was delighted with it. For all that, the letter troubled her greatly. For the first time in her life, she was embarking upon a secret and intimate relation with a young man. His boldness appalled her. She reproached herself for her imprudent behaviour and did not know what to do. Ought she to give up sitting at the window and, by a show of indifference, damp the young man's inclination to pursue her further? Should she return his letter to him, or answer it coldly and firmly? There was nobody to whom she could turn to for advice. She had neither female friend nor preceptor. Lizaveta Ivanovna decided to reply to the letter. She sat down at her little writing table, took pen and paper and began to ponder. Several times she made a start and then tore the paper across. What she had written seemed to her too indulgent or too harsh. At last she succeeded in composing a few lines in which she felt satisfied. I am sure, she wrote, that your intentions are honourable and that you had no wish to hurt me by any thoughtless conduct. But our acquaintance ought not to have begun in this manner. I return to you your letter and hope that in future I shall have no cause to complain of being shown a lack of respect which is undeserved. Next day, as soon as she saw Hermann approaching, Lizaveta Ivanovna got up from her embroidery frame, went into the drawing room, opened the little ventilating window and threw the letter into the street. Trusting the young officer's alertness, Hermann ran forward, picked up the letter and went to the confectioner's shop. Breaking the seal, he found his own letter and Lizaveta Ivanovna's reply. It was just what he had expected, and he returned home engrossed in his plot. 3 days after this, a sharp-eyed young person brought Lizaveta Ivanovna a note from a milliner's establishment. Lizaveta Ivanovna opened it uneasily, feeling it was a demand for money, and suddenly she recognised Hermann's handwriting. You have made a mistake, my dear, she said. This note is not for me. Oh, yes, it is for you, retorted the girl boldly, not troubling to conceal a knowing smile. Please read it. Lizaveta Ivanovna glanced at the letter. In it, Herman wanted her to meet him. Impossible, she cried, and alarmed at the request, at its coming so soon, and at the means employed to transmit it. I am sure this was not addressed to me. And she tore up the letter into fragments. If the letter was not for you, why did you tear it up? Said the girl. I would have returned it to the sender. Be good enough, my dear, said Lizaveta Ivanovna, flushing crimson at her remark, not to bring me any more letters, and tell the person who sent you that he ought to be ashamed. But Herman did not give in. Every day Lizaveta Ivanovna received a letter from him by one means or another. They were no longer translated from the German. Herman wrote them, inspired by passion and in a style which was his own. They reflected both his inexorable desire and the disorder of an unbridled imagination. Lizaveta Ivanovna no longer thought of returning them. She drank them in eagerly and took to answering, and the notes she sent grew longer and more affectionate every hour. At last she threw out of the window to him the following letter. There is a ball tonight at the embassy. The Countess will be there. We shall stay until about 2 o'clock. Here is an opportunity for you to see me alone. As soon as the Countess is away, the servants are sure to go to their quarters, leaving a concierge in the hall, but he usually retires to his lodge. Come at 11:30, walk straight up the stairs. If you meet anyone in the anteroom, ask if the Countess is home. They will say no, but there will be no help for it. You will have to go away. But probably you will not meet anyone. The maids all sit together in one room. Turn to the left, out of the anteroom, and keep straight on until you reach the Countess's bedroom. In the bedroom, behind a screen, you will find 2 small doors, and the one on the right leads to the study where the Countess never goes, and at the other end, on the left, opens into a small passage with a narrow, winding staircase up to my room. Herman waited for the appointed hour like a tiger trembling for its prey. By 10 o'clock in the evening, he was already standing outside the Countess's house. It was a frightful night. The wind howled, wet snow fell in big flakes, and the street lamps burned dimly. The streets were deserted. From time to time, a sledge drawn by a sorry-looking hack passed by, the driver on watch for a belated fare. Herman stood there without his greatcoat, feeling neither the wind nor the snow. At last the Countess's carriage was brought round. Herman saw the old woman wrapped up in sables being lifted into the vehicle by 2 footmen. Then Lisa, in a light cloak, with natural flowers in her hair. She flitted by. The carriage doors banged. The vehicle rolled heavily on the wet snow. The concierge closed the street door. The lights in the window went out. Herman started to walk to and fro outside the deserted house. He went up to a street lamp and glanced at his watch. It was 20 minutes past 11. He stood still by the lamppost, his eyes fixed on the hand of the watch. Precisely at 11:30, Herman walked up the steps to the house and entered the brightly lit vestibule. The concierge was not there. Herman ran up the stairs, opened the door of the anteroom, and saw a footman asleep in a soiled, old-fashioned armchair by the side of the lamp. With a light, firm tread, Herman passed quickly by him. The ballroom and the drawing room were in darkness, but the lamp in the anteroom shed a dim light into them. Herman entered the bedroom. Ancient icons filled the stand before them, which burned a golden lamp on it. Armchairs upholstered in faded damask and sofas with down cushions, the tassels of which had lost their gilt, were ranged with depressing symmetry around the walls, upon which hung Chinese wallpaper. On one of the walls were 2 portraits painted in Paris by Madame Lebrun. The first of a stout, red-faced man of some 40 years of age, in a green light uniform with a star on his breast. The other, a beautiful young woman with aquiline nose and a rose in the powdered hair drawn back over her temples. Every corner was crowded with porcelain shepherdesses, clocks made by the celebrated Leroy, little boxes, roulettes, fans, and all the 1,001 playthings invented for ladies of fashion at the end of the last century, together with Montgolfier's balloon and Mesmer's magnetism. Herman stepped behind the screen. A small iron bedstead stood there. To the right was the door into the study, to the left the other door into the passage. Herman opened it and saw the narrow winding staircase leading to a poor little Lisa's room, but he turned about and went into the dark study. The time passed slowly, everything was quiet. The drawing room clock struck 12, and the clocks in the other rooms chimed 12, one after the other, and all was still again. Herman stood leaning against the cold stove. He was quite calm. His heart beat evenly, like that of a man resolved upon a dangerous but inevitable undertaking. The clock struck 1, and then 2. He heard the distant rumble of a carriage. In spite of himself, he was overcome with agitation. The carriage drove up to the house and stopped. He heard the clatter of the carriage steps being lowered. In the house all was commotion. Servants ran to and fro. There was a confusion of voices, and lights appeared everywhere. 3 ancient ladies' maids bustled into the bedroom, followed by the countess, who, half dead with fatigue, sank into the Voltaire armchair. Herman watched through a crack in the door. Lizaveta Ivanovna passed close by him, and he heard her footsteps hurrying to the stairs into her room. For a moment something akin to remorse assailed him, but he quickly hardened his heart again. The countess began undressing before the looking-glass. Her maids took off the cap trimmed with roses and lifted the powdered wig from her grey, closely cropped head. Pins showered about her. The silver-trimmed yellow dress fell at her puffy feet. Herman witnessed the hideous mysteries of her toilette. At last the countess put on bed jacket and nightcap, and in this attire, more suited to her age, she seemed less horrible and ugly. Like most old people, the countess suffered from sleeplessness. Having undressed, she sat down in a big armchair by the window and dismissed her maids. They took away the candles, leaving only the lamp before the icons to light the room. The countess sat there, her skin sallow with age, her flabby lips twitching, her body swaying to and fro. Her dim eyes were completely vacant, and looking at her one might have imagined the dreadful old woman was rocking her body not from choice, but owing to some secret galvanic mechanism. Suddenly an inexplicable change came over her, and came all over the death-like face. The lips ceased to move, the eyes brightened. Before the countess stood in front of her, she saw a strange young man. "Do not be alarmed. For heaven's sake, do not be alarmed," he said in a low, clear voice. "I have no intention of doing you any harm. I have come to beg a favour of you." The old woman stared at him in silence, as if she had not heard. Herman thought she must be deaf. Bending down to her ear, he repeated what he had just said. The old woman remained as silent as before. "You can ensure the happiness of my whole life," Herman went on, "and at no cost to yourself. I know that you can name 3 cards in succession." Herman stopped. The countess appeared to have grasped what he wanted and to be seeking words to frame her answer. "It was a joke," she said at last. "I swear to you, it was a joke." "No, madam," Herman retorted angrily. "Remember Chaplitsky and how you enabled him to win back his loss." The countess was plainly perturbed. Her face expressed profound agitation, but soon she relapsed into her former impassivity. "Can you not tell me those 3 winning cards?" Herman went on. The countess said nothing. Herman continued. "For whom would you keep your secret? For your grandsons? They are rich enough already. They don't appreciate the value of money. Your 3 cards would not help a spendthrift. A man who does not take care of his inheritance will die a beggar, though all the demons of the world are at his command. I am not a spendthrift. I know the value of money. Your 3 cards would not be wasted on me." "Well?" He paused, feverishly waiting for her reply. She was silent. Herman fell on his knees. "If your heart has ever known what it is to love, if you can remember the ecstasies of love, if you have ever smiled tenderly at the cry of your newborn son, if any human feeling has ever stirred in your breast, I appeal to you as wife, beloved one, mother, I implore you by all that is holy in life not to reject my prayer. Tell me your secret. Of what use is it to you? Perhaps it is bound up with some terrible sin, with the loss of eternal salvation, some bargain with the devil. Reflect. You are old. You have not much longer to live, and I am ready to take your sin upon my soul. Only tell me your secret. Remember that a man's happiness is in your hands. But not only I, but my children and my children's children will bless your memory and hold it sacred. The old woman answered not a word. Herman rose to his feet. You old hag, he said, grinding his teeth. Then I will make you speak. With these words, he drew a pistol from his pocket. At the sight of a pistol, the Countess for the second time showed signs of agitation. Her head shook and she raised a hand as though to protect herself from a shot. Then she fell back and was still. Come, an end to this childish nonsense, said Herman, seizing her by the arm. I ask you for the last time, will you tell me those 3 cards? Yes or no? The Countess made no answer. Herman saw that she was dead. Lizaveta Ivanovna was sitting in her room, still in her ball dress, lost in thought. On returning home, she had made haste to dismiss the sleepy maid who reluctantly offered to help her, saying she would undress herself, and with trembling heart had gone to her own room, expecting to find Herman and hoping that she would not find him. A glance convinced her that he was not there, and she thanked fate for having prevented their meeting. She sat down without undressing and began to recall the circumstances that had led her so far in so short a time. It was not 3 weeks since she had first caught sight of a young man from a window, and yet she was carrying on a correspondence with him, and he had already succeeded in inducing her to agree to a nocturnal tryst. She knew his name only because he had signed some of his letters. She had never spoken to him, did not know the sound of his voice, had never heard him mentioned until that evening. Strange to say, that very evening at the ball, Tomsky, piqued with the young Princess Pauline for flirting with somebody else instead of him, as she usually did, she decided to revenge himself by a show of indifference. He asked Lizaveta Ivanovna to be his partner and dance the interminable mazurka with her. All the time he kept teasing her about her partiality for officers of the engineers, assuring her that he knew far more than she could suppose. And some of his sallies so found their mark that several times Lizaveta Ivanovna thought he must know her secret. Who told you all this? She asked, laughing. A friend of someone you know, Tomsky answered, a very remarkable person. And who is this remarkable man? His name is Herman. Lizaveta Ivanovna said nothing, but her hands and feet turned to ice. This Herman, continued Tomsky, is a truly romantic figure. He has a profile of a Napoleon and the soul of a Mephistopheles. I think there must be 3 crimes on his conscience. How pale you look. I have a bad headache. Well, and what did this Herman, or whatever his name is, tell you? Herman is very annoyed with his friend. He says that in his place, he would act quite differently. I suspect, in fact, that Herman's designs upon you himself. At any rate, he listens to his friend's ecstatic exclamations with anything but indifference. But where has he seen me? In church, perhaps, or when you were out walking. Heaven only knows. In your own room, maybe, while you were asleep. For there is nothing he... 3 ladies, coming up to invite Tomsky to choose between oubli ou regret, interrupted the conversation, which had become so painfully interesting to Lizaveta Ivanovna. The lady chosen by Tomsky was the Princess Pauline herself. She succeeded in effecting a reconciliation with him while they danced an extra turn and spun around once more before she was conducted to her chair. When he returned to his place, neither Herman nor Lizaveta Ivanovna was in Tomsky's thoughts. Lizaveta Ivanovna longed to resume the interrupted conversation, but the mazurka came to an end, and shortly afterwards the old countess took her departure. Tomsky's words were nothing more than the usual small talk of a ballroom, but they sank deep into the girl's romantic heart. The portrait sketched by Tomsky resembled the picture she had herself drawn, and thanks to the novels of the day, the commonplace figure both terrified and fascinated her. She sat there with her bare arms crossed, and with her head, still adorned with flowers, sunk upon her naked bosom. Suddenly the door opened, and Hermann came in. She shuddered. "Where were you?" she asked in a frightened whisper. "In the old countess's bedroom," Hermann answered. "I have just left her. The countess is dead." "Merciful heavens! What are you saying?" "And I think," added Hermann, "that I am the cause of her death." Lizaveta darted a glance at him and heard Tomsky's words echo in her soul. There must be at least 3 crimes on his conscience. Hermann sat down on the window beside her and related all that had happened. Lizaveta Ivanovna listened to him aghast. So all those passionate letters, those ardent pleas, the bold, determined pursuit had not been inspired by love. Money! That was all that his soul craved. It was not she who could satisfy his desires and make him happy. Poor child, she had been nothing but the blind tool of a thief, of a murderer, of her aged benefactress. She wept bitterly in vain agony of repentance. Hermann watched in silence. He too was suffering torment, but neither the poor girl's tears nor her indescribable charm in her grief touched his hardened soul. He felt no pricking of conscience at the thought of a dead old woman. The only thing which horrified him was the irreparable loss of a secret which was to have brought him wealth. "You are a monster," said Lizaveta Ivanovna at last. "I did not mean her to die," Hermann answered. "My pistol was not loaded." Both were silent. Morning came. Lizaveta Ivanovna blew out the candle which had burned down. A pale light illuminated the room. She wiped her tear-stained eyes and looked up at Hermann. He was sitting on the windowsill with his arms folded, like a menacing frown all over his face. In this attitude he bore a remarkable likeness to the portrait of Napoleon. The likeness struck even Lizaveta Ivanovna. "How shall I get you out the house?" she said at last. "I had thought of taking you down the secret staircase, but that means going through the bedroom, and I am afraid." "Tell me how to find the secret staircase, and I will go alone." Lizaveta rose, took a key from a chest of drawers and gave it to Hermann with precise instructions. Hermann pressed her cold, unresponsive hand, kissed her bowed head and left her. He walked down the winding stairway and entered the countess's bedroom again. The dead woman sat as though she had turned to stone. Her face wore a look of proud tranquillity. Hermann stood in front of her and gazed long and earnestly at her, as though trying to convince himself of a terrible truth. Then he went into the study, felt behind the tapestry for the door, and began to descend a dark stairway, excited by his strange emotions. Maybe some 30 or 60 years ago, at this very hour, some happy youth, long since turned into dust, was stealing up this staircase into that very room in an embroidered tunic, his hair dressed in a royal way, pressing his 3-cornered hat to his breast, and today the heart of the aged mistress has ceased to beat. At the bottom of the stairs, Hermann saw a door, which he opened with the same key, and he found himself in a passage leading into the street. 3 days after the fatal night, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Hermann repaired to a convent where the last respects were to be paid to the mortal remains of a dead countess. Though he felt no remorse, he could not altogether stifle the voice of conscience which kept repeating to him, "You are the old woman's murderer." Having very little religious faith, he was exceedingly superstitious. Believing that the dead countess might exercise a malignant influence on his life, he decided to go to her funeral to beg and obtain her forgiveness. The church was full. Hermann had difficulty in making his way through the crowd. The coffin rested on a rich bench beneath a canopy of velvet. The dead woman lay with her hands crossed on her breast, in a lace cap and a white satin robe. Around her stood members of her household, servants in black clothes, with ribbons on their shoulders and lighted candles in their hands, relatives in deep mourning, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. No one wept, though. Tears would have been too affected. The Countess was so old that her death could not have taken anyone by surprise, and her family had long ceased to think of her as one of the living. A famous preacher delivered the funeral oration. In simple and touching phrases, he described the peaceful passing of the saintly woman whose long life had been quiet, touching preparation for a Christian end. The angel of death, he declared, found her vigilant in devout meditation, awaiting the midnight coming of the bridegroom. The service was concluded in melancholy decorum. First, the relations went forward to bid farewell of the corpse. They were followed by a long procession of all those who had come to render their last homage to one who for so many years had been a participator in their frivolous amusements. After them came the members of the Countess's household. The last of these was an old woman retainer the same age as the deceased. 2 young girls supported her by the arms. She had not the strength to prostrate herself, and she was the only one to shed tears as she kissed her mistress's cold hand. Hermann decided to approach the coffin after her. He knelt down on a cold stone, strewed with branches of spruce, and remained in that position for some minutes. At last he rose to his feet, and, pale as the deceased herself, walked up the steps and bent over the corpse. At the moment it seemed to him that the dead woman started a mocking look at him and winked her eye. Hermann drew back, missed his footing, and crashed headlong to the floor. They picked him up. At the same time, Lizaveta Ivanovna was carried out of the church in a swoon. This incident momentarily upset the solemnity of the mournful rite. There was a dull murmur among the congregation, and a tall, thin man in the uniform of a court chamberlain, a close relative of the deceased, whispered in the ear of an Englishman who was standing near him that the young officer was the natural son of the Countess, to which the Englishman coldly replied, "Oh." The whole of that day Hermann was strangely troubled. Repairing to a quiet little tavern to dine, he drank a great deal of wine, contrary to his habit, in the hope of stifling his inner agitation. But the wine only served to excite his imagination. Returning home, he threw himself on his bed without undressing and fell heavily asleep. It was night when he woke, and the moon was shining into his room. He glanced at the time. It was 2:45. Sleep had left him. He sat on the bed and began thinking of the old Countess's funeral. Just then, someone in the street looked in at him through the window and immediately walked on. Hermann paid no attention. A moment later he heard the door of his anteroom open. Hermann thought it was his orderly, drunk as usual, returning from some nocturnal excursion. But presently he heard an unfamiliar footstep. Someone was softly shuffling along the floor in slippers. The door opened and a woman in white came in. Hermann mistook her for his old nurse and wondered what could have brought her here at such an hour. But the woman in white glided across the room and stood before him. Hermann recognized the Countess. "I have come to you against my will," she said in a firm voice, "but I am commanded to grant your request. The 3, the 7, and the ace will win for you if you play them in succession, provided that you do not stake more than 1 card in 24 hours and never play again as long as you live. I forgive you my death on condition that you marry my ward, Lizaveta Ivanovna." With these words, she turned softly, rustled to the door in her slippers and disappeared. Hermann heard the street door click again and saw someone peeping in at him through the window. It was a long time before he could pull himself together and go into the next room. His orderly was asleep on the floor. Herman had difficulty waking him. The man was drunk as usual. There was no getting any sense out of him. The street door was locked. Herman returned to his room and, lighting a candle, wrote down the details of his vision. Two fixed ideas cannot exist in the moral world any more than two physical bodies can occupy one and the same space. The 3, the 7, the ace soon drove all thought of the dead woman from Herman's mind. 3, 7, ace were perpetually in his head and on his lips. If he saw a young girl, he would say, "How graceful she is, a regular 3 of hearts." If he'd asked for time, he would say, 5 minutes to 7. Every stout man reminded him of the ace. 3, 7, ace. It haunted his dreams, assuming all sorts of shapes. The 3 blossomed before him like a luxuriant flower. The 7 the form of a Gothic portal, and the aces became gigantic spiders. His whole attention was focused on one thought: how to make use of a secret which had cost him so dear. He began to consider resigning his commission in order to go and travel abroad. In the public gambling houses in Paris, he would compel fortune to give him his most magical treasure. Chance spared him the trouble. A circle of wealthy gamblers existed in Moscow, presided over by the celebrated Chekalinsky, who had spent his life at the card table and amassed millions, accepting promissory notes when he won and paying his losses in ready money. He was long experienced, inspired by the confidence of his fellow players, while his open house, his famous chef, and his gay and friendly manner secured for him the general respect of the public. He came to Petersburg. The young men of the capital flocked to his rooms, forsaking balls for cards and preferring the excitement of gambling to the seductions of flirting. Narumov brought Herman to him. They passed through a succession of magnificent rooms full of attentive servants. The place was crowded. Several generals and privy councillors were playing whist. Young men smoking long pipes lounged about on sofas upholstered in damask. In the drawing room, some 20 gamblers jostled around a long table at which the master of the house was keeping bank. Chekalinsky was a man of about 60 years of age, with a most dignified appearance. He had silver grey hair, a full florid face with a kindly expression, and sparkling eyes which were always smiling. Narumov introduced Herman. Shaking hands cordially, Chekalinsky requested him not to stand on ceremony and went on dealing. The game continued for some time. On the table lay more than 30 cards. Chekalinsky paused after each round to give the players time to arrange their cards and note their losses. He listened courteously to their observations and more courteously still straightened the corner of a card that some careless hand had turned down. At last the game finished. Chekalinsky shuffled the cards and prepared to deal again. "Will you allow me to take a card?" said Herman, stretching out his hand from behind a stout gentleman who was punting. Chekalinsky smiled and bowed graciously. In silent token of consent, Narumov laughingly congratulated Herman on breaking his long abstention from cards and wished him a lucky start. "There," said Herman, chalking some figures on the back of his card. "How much?" asked the banker, screwing up his eyes. "Excuse me, I cannot see." 47,000, Herman answered. At these words, every head turned in a flash. All eyes were fixed on Herman. "He has taken leave of his senses," thought Narumov. "Allow me to point to you," said Chekalinsky with an unfailing smile, "that you are playing rather high. Nobody here has ever staked more than 275 at a time." "Well," returned Herman, "do you accept my card or not?" Chekalinsky bowed with the same air of a humble acquiescence. I only wanted to observe that being honoured with the confidence of my friends, I could only play against ready money. For my own part, of course, I am perfectly sure that your word is sufficient, but for the sake of the rules of the game and our accounts, I must request that you place money on your card. Herman took a banknote from his pocket and handed it to Czekalinsky, who after a cursory glance placed it on Herman's card. He began to deal. On the right, a 9 turned up, and on the left, a 3. I win, said Herman, pointing to his card. There was a murmur of astonishment among the company. Czekalinsky frowned, but the smile quickly reappeared on his face. Would you like me to settle now? He asked Herman. If you please. Czekalinsky took out a number of banknotes from his pocket and paid them there and then. Herman picked up his money and left the table. Naramov could not believe his eyes. Herman drank a glass of lemonade and departed home. The following evening he appeared at Czekalinsky's again. The host was dealing. Herman walked up to the table. The players immediately made room for him. Czekalinsky bowed graciously, and Herman waited for the next deal, took a card, and placed on it his original 47,000, together with the winnings of the day before. Czekalinsky began to deal. A knave turned up on the right, a 7 on the left. Herman showed his 7. There was a general exclamation. Czekalinsky was obviously disconcerted. He counted out 94,000 and handed them to Herman, who pocketed them in the coolest manner and instantly withdrew. The next evening, Herman again made his appearance at the table. Everyone was expecting him. The generals and the privy councillors left their whist to watch such an extraordinary play. The young officers leapt up from their sofas, and all the waiters collected from the drawing room. Everyone pressed around Herman. The other players let off punting, impatient to see what would happen. Herman stood at the table, prepared to play alone against Czekalinsky, who was pale but smiling. Each broke the seal off a pack of cards. Czekalinsky shuffled. Herman took a card and covered it with a pile of banknotes. It was like a duel. Deep silence reigned in the room. Czekalinsky began dealing. His hands trembled. A queen fell on the right, an ace on the left. Ace wins, said Herman, and showed his card. Your queen has lost, said Czekalinsky gently. Herman started. Indeed, instead of an ace, there lay before him the Queen of Spades. He could not believe his eyes, or think how he could have made such a mistake. At that moment it seemed to him that the Queen of Spades opened and closed her eye and mocked him with a smile. He was struck by the extraordinary resemblance. The old woman! He cried in terror. Czekalinsky gathered up his winnings. Herman stood rooted to the spot. When he left the table, everyone began talking at once. A fine game, that, said the players. Czekalinsky shuffled his cards afresh, and the game resumed as usual. Conclusion. Herman went out of his mind. He is now in room number 17 of the Obyhov Hospital. He returns no answer to questions put to him, but mutters over and over again with incredible rapidity, 3-7 ace, 3-7 ace. Lizaveta Ivanovna has married a very pleasant young man. He is in the civil service somewhere and has a good income. He is the son of the old countess's former steward. Lizaveta Ivanovna, in her turn, is bringing up a poor relative. And Tomsky, who has been promoted to the rank of captain, has married the Princess Pauline.